Everything has a past. Everything. A person, an object, a word, everything. If you don't know the past, you can't understand the present and plan properly for the future. Potop. Peace, family. It's the Hood Mystic, representing www.hoodmystic.com. In the foundations of this country, in the formation of its ideals towards its black population, we have to take a closer look at the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial Florida, where the amalgamation of the black and Indian persons into one tribe, the Seminole, has created a forgotten legacy that still rings true to this day. We will take a scholarly look into the history of this land that was not fully penetrated by the Europeans until 1842 and was in fact ruled by melanated tribes since recorded history. We were taught that black people in this continent came from Africa as slaves, and that the quote-unquote red Indian was the true Native American. We're told that Europeans took all quote-unquote black slaves from Africa and stole this land, America specifically, from the quote-unquote red Indian. But this runs contrary to the Italian explorer Giovanni de Verrazzano's letter to King Francis of France in 1524. This is how he described the native population. They are dark in color, not unlike the Ethiopians. When William Penn first met the Lenape Indians of Philadelphia, he described the Indians as such, for they are generally tall, well-built, and of singular proportion. They tread strong, clever, and mostly walk with a lofty chin. Of complexion, black, but by design, the gypsies in England. They grease themselves with bare fat clarified, and they use no defense against the sun or weather. Their skins must be swarthy. Swarthy just means dark. So there seems to be an element of dark Indians in this continent long before 1619, when 20 so-called Negroes first arrived in Jamestown. Many might assume that the Underground Railroad traveled in one direction, north to freedom, away from slavery and the plantations of the South. But few realize that runaway slaves also fled south into Florida for almost 2 centuries before the Civil War. In the forming of the slave narrative, Florida just seems to be a forgotten place. It seems as though Florida was a haven and a safe place for the melanated slaves, free persons before the existence of colonial America. This video examines exactly why this history does not often get spoken about.
It's hard to imagine that Hollywood hasn't jumped all over this. You would think it would be box office gold. I don't understand why there hasn't been more attention to John Horse and the Black Seminoles. They created the largest haven in the U.S. South for runaway slaves. They led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. They secured the only emancipation of rebellious slaves prior to the U.S. Civil War, and they formed the largest mass exodus of slaves across the United States, moving from the Florida Everglades through Indian Territory, what would become Oklahoma, eventually locating in Mexico, where they secured title to their own land. It's a remarkable story. It's overlooked not just by filmmakers, it's not well known in popular culture, and in fact it's been overlooked by historians of slavery, if you can believe it. One Seminole leader at the time was the leader Osceola, who is justly remembered by history. Another leader who rose up at this time was John Horse, who was ethnically a Black Seminole, and who would ultimately lead his people on a long and trying exodus for their freedom. In 1838, John Horse and the Black Seminoles agreed to stop fighting the U.S. government in exchange for moving to what was then considered to be Indian Territory, which is now today the state of Oklahoma, and for legal recognition of their freedom. So despite the fact many of them were runaway slaves, they would have the opportunity to start over again as free individuals.
What is not well known is that before Virginia was colonized by Great Britain, Spain held claim to this land. They never could gain hold of this land based on a black rebel faction in Florida. Spain at first fought against this force, but after realizing that it could not defeat it, began to empower this group so it could fight against the encroaching British army from the north. Listen to this. What I had to remark was a relation he made that no less than 19 Negro slaves that he had in Carolina ran away from him lately all at once, under that strong temptation of the Spaniards making all free that fled to them from the English, which he said found verified, because he saw all his Negroes now at St. Augustine, who now laugh at him. And this is in reference to a slave owner who had some slaves that just ran away from him to Florida. And once he seen them in St. Augustine, they just laughed at him because they were now free people.
Greeks and the Phoenicians had sailed these waters for centuries, setting up small trade cities and colonies. The Carthaginians, who were descendants of the Phoenicians themselves, set up a large trade empire between 650 and 300 BC, including parts of southern Spain, before coming into conflict with the Romans, who by the 3rd century were still a fledgling republic, just toying with the idea of conquering outside of Italy. This all changed with the Punic Wars, in which Rome came out on top with a slip victory over the Carthaginians' leader, Hannibal. But Visigoth Spain was soon to be facing a new enemy 4,000 kilometers away in Medina, where from 622 the birth of Islam began to spread through the conquest of Muhammad and the Rashidun Caliphate. The empire was further expanded into previously Byzantine holdings in Africa with remarkable efficiency and speed under the Umayyad dynasty. In 711, a Berber army crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and conquered the fractured Visigoths, slowly invading further north, halted only by their defeat by the Franks at the Battle of Tours and the Spaniards at the Battle of Covadonga. The Umayyad dynasty's collapse at the hands of the Abbasi allowed one Umayyad fugitive to claim the Spanish lands for himself, first as the Emirate and then the Caliphate of Cordoba, also called the Al-Andalus. A crusade was led against the Almohads from 1212 to 1250 by an alliance of Spanish kingdoms driving the Moors to a land known as the Granada. Castile and Aragon, two of the most powerful kingdoms in Hispaniola, united with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel to create the Kingdom of Spain, which also conquered the last remnant of Muslim Granada and the Basque Kingdom of Navarre. Around the same time, an Italian sailor was bumping around from country to country seeking sponsorship for a voyage to the East Indies. Finally, on meeting Isabel and Ferdinand, and after about 2 years of indecisiveness, King Ferdinand agreed to fund Columbus's voyage, in which he discovered the Americas. If by discovered you mean after Viking Leif Erikson and the people who already lived there.
Children in the United States learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But since there were already millions of people living on the American continents when he arrived, what is Columbus's real importance in history? This video will show what really happened during his voyages between two worlds and how they helped shape the world we know today. In 1451, Columbus was born in the Republic of Genoa. There he began his sailing career, but in 1477 he was hired as a merchant mariner for King John II of Portugal. Portugal was gaining power on the seas, colonizing Atlantic islands and establishing trade with African kingdoms. By the 1480s, they found out the Indian Ocean was on the other side of Africa. This discovery gave them a fast and cheap trade route to the rich goods of Asia. During Portugal's rise in power, a group of European scholars thought the Earth was smaller than what was previously believed. This meant one could reach Asia by sailing west. Because of the newly invented printing press, Columbus read about these recent theories and was enthralled with the idea of sailing west for riches. He tried to get funding for an expedition from Portugal, but King John didn't believe in the small Earth theory. He then tried in France, England, and Spain with no luck until 1492 when the Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand and Isabella, decided to help fund 3 ships for a voyage. They saw Columbus as a means to compete against Portugal's success. The Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria set sail on August 3, 1492.
The nature of Pedro Menendez's enterprise of Florida. Pedro Menendez de Aviles had a vision for his Florida enterprise: turn La Florida into a money-maker. Here's how he began the pursuit of profiting. A contract was drawn up and signed March 15, 1565 by Spanish King Philip II. The purpose of the venture, according to the contract, was to convert the Indians to the Holy Faith and conquer, explore, and populate Florida. So why was his mission called an enterprise and not a conquest? Here's why. A conquest is a subjugation and assumption of control of a place or people by use of military force, an action that was very far away from Menendez's job description. An enterprise, however, is a project or an undertaking that is difficult and requires effort. Now that definition lines up with Menendez's Florida career. His contract was very unique in what provisions were included. Remember, prior to Menendez, no other Spanish explorers successfully established their goals of settlement and were mostly met with disaster. A successful enterprise full of profit would push the Spanish Empire into riches that would surpass their opponent powers of the French and British. If Pedro Menendez were to be successful in finding more efficient trade routes, Spain would have vast control throughout Europe. The enterprise of Florida was critical to Spanish rule. Both Menendez and King Philip II would profit, and the plan would provide a never-ending stream of money. The Spanish drive of economic gain is a theme nestled deep within Florida's past that continues to this day with tourism and agriculture.
Thanks to Spain. We have to remember that these black rebels, warriors, and protectors of Florida were not able to tell their story. So this video attempts to do just that. When the fall of Granada happened in Spain in 1492, the Moors who ruled since 711 dispersed to many locations, one of which is Florida. And it is interesting to note that the indigenous people of Florida have Moorish roots, and it was after the Moors were defeated in Europe that Ponce de Leon made his famous discovery. The question now is to ask then, is there a direct correlation? Jamaica was one of the final destinations for many of these Moorish captives who were simply referred to as Negro slaves from Spain. But given the background of the Moors, who were not only once conquerors by establishing empires over 3 continents, but were also culturally enlightened people, resistant to subordination or subjugation in various forms by them from a common feature in the New World. Thus, these Maroons or Caribbean Moors who rebelled against slavery were noted to be in the Caribbean islands, North and Central and South America, and also West Africa. So obviously, no ships transported all of these people and put them in all of these locations simultaneously. So it can clearly be seen that there were dark melanated indigenous people already in those regions before slavery. And that's not even a stretch to the imagination. You could just simply think about how dark-skinned people existed all over the planet before colonialization. So you can deduce that everybody didn't come from ships from Africa. Pedro Menendez found St. Augustine, the first permanent European settlement in what would become the United States. One place he failed, however, was his relationship with the Florida Indians. The situation deteriorated until Menendez called for the enslavement of the South Florida Indians in 1573. To bolster his petition, as he called it, a war of fire and blood, with those taken alive, sold his slaves to the neighboring islands of Cuba, Santo Domingo, and Puerto Rico. When Spain described these Indians on Florida, he described them as light brown or dark skin. The inability for Spain to conquer this land and other than small trade ports of St. Augustine indicates that the indigenous presence here was too strong to be taken over by military force, which makes Florida an anomaly in all of the lands in colonial history.
And so the Yamasee and the Creek are important because along with the Chickasaw, they are going to be the principal slavers, the principal allies of the English from the mid-1680s on to the Yamasee War. And they are especially going to target people where? All right, very good. And I'm going to have you guys do some work here in a second, so stay with me. They are especially going to target peoples in Florida. and we've already kind of introduced this. Florida is strategically important to the Spanish. Very important. Because a lot of the New World wealth that's coming out of Central and South America is being shipped around the coast of Florida back to Spain. And so as a military outpost, it's very, very significant to their empire. But Florida is on the northern fringes of this Spanish empire, and it's a weak outpost. And they're more concerned with bringing this mission system to native peoples of the region, trying to convert them, trying to assimilate them. And it has limited success. I'm not going to get into all the details there because we have a short class. But they're particularly active among people like the Appalachee, who we read about. A group of about 10,000 or more heavily fortified towns around modern Tallahassee. And they're going to have a fairly close, not a perfect relationship, but a fairly close relationship with the Spanish. So while they're formidable, the odds are against them. Because these slavers who are coming down, are bent on getting slaves, and they're heavily armed. And so they are going to, if you look on the map here on the right, if you look on the map, you can see that, as early as the late 1650s up into 1711, to the, getting towards the Tuscarora and Yamasee War, you can see how, extensive these raids were, that they even went to the tip of the Florida Keys looking for Indian slaves.
The first permanent settlement in what would become the United States was established by Spain in 1565. That was St. Augustine in Florida. Florida was actually two provinces, West Florida and East Florida. The United States and Spain had an ongoing disagreement over the boundary of West Florida. East Florida, though, clearly belonged to the Spanish, and it became a refuge for runaway slaves, pirates, and especially Seminole Indians who raided and threatened settlements in Georgia. In 1817, President James Monroe sent General Andrew Jackson to Florida to stop the Seminole raids. Jackson was told he could cross the border into Florida, but should not attack any Spanish forts. Jackson had another idea. Jackson marched into Florida, deposed the Spanish governor, and installed one of his officers in his place. In 1819, a treaty was signed in Washington. East Florida went to the United States, and Spain gave up all its claims to West Florida. Florida, the Sunshine State, joined the Union in 1845.
The native population has always been at a disadvantage when factoring them in history, though, based on written accounts of the time were penned by Spaniards and Frenchmen and not by the American Indians. So to understand the Seminoles, we need to understand that there was a rebel faction in Florida since ancient times. Well, basically since 1492 at least, up until 1842. And this population consisted of melanated runaways from the Indian and African slave trade. And it's important to understand this. By being an Indian/African, it did not necessarily make you so. And it's also important to understand that there was a war between England and Spain used the Seminoles/Indians/Black Indians as their military force. So in order not to be confused on this, let's take a close look at the word Maroon/Cimarron, aka Seminole.
We want to be known as how we are today. We're living, we're breathing, we still have our culture, we still have our language. And we want to be looked at as Americans as well. And I think for some reason, the American dream is that they forget about the Native Americans. I am Everett Osceola, and I am Seminole. The way we used to live was by war. The way we used to live was by survival. The Seminoles are called the unconquered people because we were the only tribe within U.S. history to not sign any treaties. Seminole actually was derived from a dialect of Spanish. They just said Cimarron, meaning wild one or the untamed ones. So it got butchered over time and over generations that it was called Seminole. But in a way, it kind of stuck because we weren't part of the Creeks, we weren't part of the Choctaws or the Chickasaws. We actually were a part of some of the ancient tribes.
When Spanish colonists arrived in the Western Hemisphere, They referred to the first runaway cattle and later to the Native American and African slaves as Seminole. The word is defined as wild, unruly, or as a runaway slave. Perhaps the most common usage of the term Seminole comes from an abbreviated form, maroon. By the late 17th century, Native Americans and Africans who were slaves in British and South Carolina escaped into Florida. Seminole is an English corruption of Cimarron. During this period, the combined population of those South Carolina Cimarrones, newly arriving free natives, plus more African runaways from both Georgia and South Carolina began to be identified as the Seminole by the British, because Seminole is an English corruption of Cimarron. While Seminole can be seen as an English corruption of Cimarron, it was widely applied to Creek Indians who had never been slaves. Generally, runaway slaves from South Carolina and Georgia will be referred to as Maroons before the American Revolution and African Seminoles after the establishment of the United States. The word Seminole is a corruption of Cimarron, and it became to be used only after British obtained Florida in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The word Seminole originally applied to Creeks who migrated into Florida, only to be applied to Africans later.
The Creek American Indians, or Muskogee Nation, was not an individual tribe. It was actually a confederacy of different tribes in the southeast. It boasted a sophisticated political structure, with tribal towns maintaining their own autonomy within the larger union. The early white settlers called the Muskogee one of the 5 civilized tribes because they lived in one place, were friendly to and traded with white men, and integrated certain aspects of their European neighbors' culture into their own lives. The Red Stick Rebellion was a civil war between Creek tribes that was later absorbed into the War of 1812. At the end of the war, a peace treaty was signed that forced the Muskogee to cede more than half their land to the United States, even though many Muskogee had fought alongside Andrew Jackson. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act.
So as the United States is coming into Florida, the Red Stick War feels remarkably alive. The United States tracks down Red Stick leaders and has them executed. So he's trying to track down all these Red Sticks, all these runaway slaves and the property that the Red Sticks absconded with out of the Creek Nation. And all along the way, it's not Jackson leading the way. Remember where we started. The fighting was done before we arrived. It was McIntosh, or McIntosh's inferiors, his followers, or other Indian leaders, finding the villages, raising the villages, finding the Red Sticks who were, hostile to the interests of the Creek National Council. This is nation building in its most aggressive way we can imagine.
In 1693, the King of Spain issued an order to Spanish authorities in St. Augustine, Florida. This order is recorded in the archives of the Indies. In the order, the king, discussing the fate of several runaway African slaves from Charleston, South Carolina, said that these slaves, which had just arrived to Florida, should be set free and given anything they need and favor them as much as possible. After England settled in Carolina, a military conflict began between her and Spain. But as English strength grew in North America, the Spanish level of preparedness proved inadequate. Therefore, it seems that the king knew from experience in Panama and Jamaica that these Maroons was not to be played with. Additionally, as stated in the archives, by 1738, the number of Maroons had become so great that the governor had them build combination and military forts. This fort had to be encountered before St. Augustine could be attacked. This fort was called Mose, and it stood as the first line of defense for Spain and Florida until the Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced Spain to yield Florida to the British, but this fort symbolized Maroon autonomy and existed only because the Maroons' political significance. This was a free African town in Spanish colonial Florida. The reason Spain stayed in power for so long in Florida is based on the fort protected by these quote-unquote Marines, who later became known as the Seminoles, who even later became to be known as African slaves. The New York Treaty was signed by the Secretary of War Knox and several other Creek chiefs. The chiefs agreed to exist under U.S. protection rather than Spanish in all Creeks, and this included the Seminole, were to be remained at peace with the U.S. Additionally, the Creeks agreed to deliver all Negroes among the Seminole to the commander of U.S. forces in southern Georgia. This treaty was signed in 1790. The Creek leaders ceded a significant portion of their hunting grounds, including land stretching to the Oconee River, to the United States, and agreed to turn runaway slaves over to federal authorities. Although the Creek leaders averred the convincing that the Creek people to honor their new boundary lines or return African American slaves would be difficult at best.
In 1790, President George Washington appealed to McGillivray to sue for peace. Responding to Washington's request, McGillivray, the principal chief of the Creek Indians, traveled to the nation's capital of New York. What resulted of this meeting would be McGillivray signing the Treaty of New York. The treaty was largely ignored in Georgia. Subsequent treaties over the following years would render more land from the Creek Indians. After America became engaged in a battle with England in the War of 1812, a loose confederation of Indians were united together striving to fight for their remaining land. These Red Sticks, as they would become known, for their desire to war against those who oppressed them, would eventually side with the British in order to fight against the Americans. In 1825, a Creek chief by the name of William McIntosh agreed to his own treaty with the Georgia government that would give up the remaining land held by the Creek Indians. Accordingly, many of the Creek were not pleased with this treaty. A few disgruntled Creek Indians would collaborate revenge against McIntosh by burning him to death in his own home. Regardless, the Creek Indians in Georgia were no more.
In the Book of Treaties and Other International Acts of the United States, the author lists secret articles in the New York Treaty. He writes that these secret articles were never publicized but were kept in the State Department archives. In exchange for capturing slaves in Florida, the minor chiefs were to receive $100 per year, and Chief McGillivray was paid $200 per year. And the author says that the Indian removal policy, as well as the Seminole War, were part of the government cover-up, which went all the way back to George Washington. The Giddings refers to these secret treaties of New York and Colerain. He says that the Creeks were illegally paid to be slave catchers. In the plot to steal Florida, Joseph B. Smith writes that 1790, Thomas Jefferson covertly began making plans to take Florida from Spain. Smith says that in 1790, Spain began allowing Americans to settle in Florida. Jefferson told Washington that this new Spanish policy presented an opportunity to acquire Florida. According to Smith, Jefferson believed that if enough Americans settled in Florida, the government can incite a rebellion and acquire the territory. The House and the Senate authorized a secret war to acquire Florida, and if this rebellion failed, 400 U.S. troops and mercenaries went into Florida from Georgia and West Florida in 1813. Smith reported that Madison sought to entice the Seminole into supporting the U.S., but he says that instead, the African Seminole led the effort against the Americans. When it was obvious that the Seminole cannot be subdued, Congress ordered the troops to retreat. In the book, The History of the United States, Henry Adams writes that during the administrations of Jefferson and Madison, the nation was dominated by the South. The South was dominated by slave interests, and the foremost issue on the minds of the slaveholders was the acquisition of Florida. In general, the nation believed it was an Indian war. However, those in Congress who knew the truth would say nothing because to press the issue of slavery. Key political policies which tend to suggest that African Seminoles rather than Spain were the primary target of both Madison and Monroe were developed by the government before, during, and after the war. This leads to the belief that during the Madison administration, the nation's policy has shifted from the general goal of acquiring Florida to neutralizing the African Seminoles specifically. The Indian Springs Treaty distinguished the African Seminole as a special entity in the formation of national policy. Porter Giddings acknowledged that special emphasis which the U.S. placed upon the Africans. Another so-called Indian treaty which emphasized special treatment for Africans led to the Second Seminole War, and further suggested that Africans were once at the core of the nation's Seminole diplomacy. America's effort to separate the African and Indian Seminole initiated the Second Seminole War, the goal of which was to enslave the Africans and move the Indians to the west. The Seminole War was the Black War and not an Indian War.
Reality is that Indians have been in uniform in our country since its formation. Now, the Civil War is a real serious issue because the reality is that the South, most of the main tribes were located in the South. You know, the so-called civilized tribes, you know, the Choctaws, the Cherokees, the Creeks. And as you may be aware, Indians also had slavery. The slavery was kind of colorblind because, you were a slave in a sense, but you could be married into the tribe. You could be equal in a lot of ways. Like, Osceola, the chief of the Seminoles, his mother was black. Blacks had a different kind of status when they were slaves of Indians, as opposed to the non-Indian community in the South. So anyhow, when the war broke out, it was almost logical that the Indians would protect their homeland, and the Confederacy very much wanted Indian allegiance, and what they promised the Indians was that when they won the Civil War, the Indians would then be able to be in their parliament, in their Congress, as equal members. Now, that's something unheard of for Indians in the North. I mean, Indians were just always the bottom of the totem pole. And so what you had then were thousands and thousands of Indians in uniform fighting for the Confederacy. But I mean, this is the kind of dignity and class that Indians have provided in the military.
At 6 years and 7 months, the longest Indian war in American history, a war that almost destroyed the Seminole tribe, sent blacks into slavery, opened Florida for white settlement, and made it possible to transform a vast battleground into the nation's playground.
As stated earlier, the story of the Moors in Florida does not get the benefit of their side of the story based on coming out on the losing side of the battle. When we discuss the numbers and the differences between Native Americans, Africans, Maroons, we have to deduce to understand that these people are not different, but the same. During the Second Seminole War in the 1830s, United States Commander General Jessup informed the Secretary War Poncet that Florida was an unexplored wilderness, the interior of which we were as ignorant as the interior of China. With only a fraction of the latter of United States manpower and resources in Florida, it is unlikely that colonial Spain or Britain were any better informed about the number or location of rebel African slaves. The continuous presence of military autonomous rebels helps explain African slavery in the 5 civilized tribes. It was encouraged by the British in the southeastern colonies, and it seems that those with European fathers and native mothers were the key participants. So what is now we have is an Indian population that has separated from the ancient population based on European fathers now leading the tribes and directing them to align with the federal government. The displaced darker-skinned tribesmen and women are now labeled as African slaves. Neither the British colonial government nor the United States would allow neutral policy by natives on the subject of slavery. Even before Washington administration, the Continental Congress had stipulation and treaties with at least 13 native peoples for the return of escaped slaves. Southern whites worried that Indians and blacks might combine against them, and it is my contention that whites in the time passed on to the Southern Indians some of their more derogatory perceptions of blacks, and the 5 civilized tribes followed whites in enslaving, disliking, and pulling apart from blacks. The Cherokees, Chickasaws, Creeks, Choctaws, and Seminoles were known as the 5 civilized tribes. Except for the Seminoles, the 5 civilized tribes produced written constitutions which included slave codes. Though slavery among the tribes was perhaps milder than among whites, still many instances of cruelty towards darker-skinned people occurred. United States congressional documents from at least 1821 to 1842 specifically state that Negroes governed the Seminole Indians. Now, this documentation was submitted to Congress from Florida governors, Seminole Indian agents, United States Army generals, and slaveholding citizens of Florida. Even though the resources indicate that both slave and free blacks live among the Seminole, at times, all blacks are referred to as the quote-unquote slaves who quote-unquote rule the Seminole. There is a lack of specific knowledge about the relationship between the Negroes and the Indians. In order to protect their allies, the Indians had to insist to white authorities that the blacks were all slaves, which they intended to defend from the depredations and claims of Americans. Also, although many officers came to sympathize and respect their Indian enemies, they suffered from the blindness of their time. They could never see the Negro enemy as capable of the dignity and intelligence they were willing to bestow on the chiefs. Joshua Giddings alone saw the role of the Negro in Florida as that of an equal partner. The roles of masters and slaves between African and natives had been reversed. Through the alliances with Spain and the Indians of Florida, rebel slaves had the capability to resist slavery from 1492 until 1842. Scholars believe that native Seminoles claimed all Africans among them as slaves as a political ploy to protect them from United States slaveholders. Most of the data concerning the Seminoles came from individuals who had some relationship to the slave industry, which sought to reclaim a fortune in slave property among the Florida natives. Sources which contend that the rebels were slaves of the natives must be viewed parallel to those which protect them as leaders among the Seminole. Though it is possible that some Africans were subjected to enslavement by the Seminole, this study takes the position that for the masses of rebels in Florida, it was a physical impossibility. So from 1492 to 1842, the Black Seminoles launched a consistent assault against the institution of slavery on the North American continent. And this was not an act of war, this was an act of freedom, and not just for themselves, but for every enslaved person on the continent.
Now, I have to tell you this, and this is important, and it kind of leads back to why you also get some of these negative words. We've always had those general savage terms for Native Americans, but the ironic thing about this particular case, and the ironic thing about the Seminoles is, the Seminoles are a homogeneous group of Native Americans themselves. Mm-hmm. They are actually The majority of them are former creeks. What happens is there's a large schism in the Creek Nation. The Creek Nation breaks. You have your upper Creeks that live in northern part of present-day Alabama. They're up, of course, by the mountains up in that area. And then you have your lower Creeks that are down in that corner between Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, right? And so what happens is the ones in the South, they began to accept plantation society. They even began to buy and trade enslaved people. And so they began to not resist plantation, but actually join and work with plantation society. And so the Creeks up north were basically, what are you doing? We don't own people. We take them as war. We hold them so we won't have to fight them again. We keep their women so we can keep our numbers up. But we don't enslave them for our own living. You know, what are you all doing? And so there's this schism. And so the northern Creeks pushed their way rather, through Alabama. They push through the southern Creeks and they come into Florida. And so when they come into Florida, they mix with the other Native Americans that are also running. You have the Miccosukee, and like I said, you have the other smaller bands. You even have some Cherokee that are leaving North Georgia and the other areas of Georgia, and they're coming down into Florida. These are smaller bands, though, that are kind of broken away because they needed to figure out how they were going to survive as well. And so they become this homogeneous group that we call the Seminoles. And it actually, when you look at the word and you trace it back, Semolina, Cimarron, it has different meanings, but the main one is Breakaway Creek or Renegade Creek. That's why everything you see with Florida State University and they say the Seminoles, the first thing you see up on it is Renegade, because that is one of the original terms for Semolina. And then there was a negative term that the Spanish gave, Cimarron, which basically meant wild beast, wild dog. And of course you can understand that it's just like anything else. When you're on the opposite side of the team, you know, when you the opponent, it's not going to be a positive word. On the other side, even when we use the word griot, most people don't know, for Europeans, they thought the word griot was a very negative word. It was a negative term, but we embrace that term. And so it's the same thing here. When we look at the words like savage and all of that good stuff, it's that opposite side of the fence type of thing.
You expose the terror. When one thinks for a second that here are people who live every waking hour, who one have been imported as slaves, others who were the original inhabitants of the land, and every waking hour they must be mindful of the tyranny that is coming at them with fire and fury that they have no experience with.
So we see that as a regular tactic, you know, that is a regular tactic that was used all the way up through the we can trace that all the way through all the way to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and other places. That this is when communities, when African American communities are out of the graces, so to speak, of the larger white community, they simply get rid of it. And they do it normally by just destroying the whole thing. And we all know fire is a pretty good tool, and it's pretty quick and easy. It's a progression. That's why we ended up in 3 Seminole Wars, because each time, we can actually see how each Seminole War directly affected the growth of Florida, and Florida becoming what it is today. The first Seminole War opened up plantation society for Florida.
Opened up plantation society. Opened up where landowners came in and built wealth off the back of slaves.
And taking the land from the Native Americans.
And taking land,
to do so.
Right.
And so what we see with that first war is, with the first Seminole War, they get to clear out the Native Americans out of North Florida, particularly the area from Tallahassee to Gainesville, because that land was considered as fertile, and in some places more fertile than even Georgia. And at this time, Georgia was becoming cotton king. And so the expansion into Florida, they figured, had to be done. And so when they remove them, we see plantation society coming in, but also this is when Florida becomes a territory. Florida becomes a territory just after the first Seminole War.
And you're right.
And
once Florida became a United States possession in 1821, whites were infuriated by black Indian relationship. Thus, from 1821 to 1835, relations between Seminoles and whites steadily deteriorated. So, how dare you, inferior people, have a civil relationship?
And not only that, continue to work together against us.
Yeah.
See, that's the thing it up. But they gave them that common, the enemy of my enemy.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And so what we see is that first war, right, clearing out the land, Florida becoming a territory. The second one, the one that the book is based on, that ends up being a 7-year war. Now, here's the issue with that. We have Native Americans who are agreeing to leave. Then we have Native Americans who said we're not going to leave.
Right.
And one in particular is Osceola. He's not a chief, but because of his war attributes, he becomes a war chief. And so you have those who are willing to stay, who want to stay and don't want to leave. But at the same token, you have your black Seminoles, right?
Right.
And at this point, we stop calling them Maroons and we call them Seminoles because they now make a concerted effort to not only live together. We have familial relationships now. It usually happens at the top, but they're still doing it. They're cohabitating together. All of those good things. Right?
Marrying.
Yes, intermarriage. It's usually done at the higher level, but between chiefs and whatnot, but it's being done. And so at that point, right, you got two different things that are going on, right? You got the Native Americans who want to keep the land. You got the blacks who want to keep their freedom, right? And so when they go into this war in 1835, is because they are fueled, of course, by the Indian removal policy from Andrew Jackson, who got his political career in Florida as well. And this is where he actually got the concept to develop the Indian removal policy by helping Florida get rid of the Seminoles the first round in North Florida. Now, once this happens, the war becomes evident that it is not about removing Native Americans, but it is more so about getting these blacks back into slavery.
Profoundly so.
We can no longer look back at history as a simple cut and dry narrative. The reality is that African slaves had a history and a legacy previous to slavery. Even during colonialism, the black factor is extremely nuanced and much more rebellious than previously stated in our textbooks. Slavery existed in the form of invasion and war in the state of Florida. For most of our recorded history, the black and Indian man was free in the land of Florida. In 1842, after the Second Seminole War, the state of Florida was explored by American settlers. 23 years later, the Emancipation Proclamation, so-called, freed the slaves throughout the colonies. So chattel slavery only existed in Florida for 23 years. We have a free and prosperous black civilization that we know little about based on the power to tell their own story. I hope this video opens your mind and empowers you to begin to do your own research and realize that there is more to the story than initially presented. But the Emancipation Proclamation freed no one, not a single slave. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state. All people shall be then in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. But only the southern states were in rebellion, and Lincoln had no control over the Confederacy, nor did he have the power to free the slaves in the South or the Union. That would require a constitutional amendment, which wouldn't occur until after the Civil War in 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but in reference to the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson says that it was necessary to put the South at a moral disadvantage by transforming the contest from a war waged against the states fighting for their independence into a war waged against states fighting for the maintenance and the extension of slavery. So with that being said, we look at the world as fighting for your freedom, but the question I ask you is, are you really free?
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. There are exceptions, including criminals.
The loophole was immediately exploited. What you got after that was a rapid transition to a mythology of black criminality.
And crime.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators.
Millions of dollars will be allocated for prison and jail facilities.
3 strikes and you are out.
It's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration because it has become heavily monetized.
The focus is on taking people from prison, putting them in community corrections, parole and probation.
How much progress is it really if now there's a private company making money off the GPS monitor?
We now have more African Americans under criminal supervision.
All the slaves back in the 1850s.